The winter of 1942 pressed against the cabinet war rooms like a living thing, damp stone, stale cigarette smoke, and the dull tremor of distant anti-aircraft guns filtering down through London's buried corridors. On the Great Wall maps, bright pins marked losses with an arithmetic that felt personal. Ships torpedoed in the Atlantic, garrisons collapsing in Asia, tank columns driving across deserts where the horizon offered no mercy. Churchill read the war as a chain of momentum, and in those months the chain seemed to be slipping through Allied hands, link by link, into the grip of enemies who had seized the initiative everywhere. Britain was no longer fighting for advantage but for air to breathe. The Royal Navy guarded routes that stretched from Halifax to Freetown, from the Clyde to Alexandria, yet U-boats hunted those same routes with industrial patience, turning the Atlantic into a mathematical battlefield of convoy speed, escort endurance, and sonar range. In the east, Japanese offensives exposed how quickly empires could unravel when surprise met thin defenses. In the west, Germany's army still held most of Europe in an iron geometry of rails and road nets, with its factories drawing on conquered labor and resources to keep the machine fed. It was a war of production and position, and Britain's margin for error had become a thin strip of sea lane and steel. America's entry after Pearl Harbor should have been the turning point, but in the first months it felt like a promise that could still be squandered. The United States had power in reserve, shipyards, assembly lines, and manpower, yet power in used was only potential, and potential did not stop Rommel's tanks or drown a wolf pack. American generals looked at the European coastline and saw the only strategic truth that mattered. Germany must be struck in France, where its main armies lived and where liberation would be real. Anything else looked like distraction, a diversion of time and landing craft, a way to postpone the hard decision and pay interest in blood later. Churchill looked at the same coastline and saw a different truth, colder and more immediate. A cross-channel assault required more than bravery. It required mastery of airfields, landing craft by the thousands, trained formations practiced in amphibious movement, and logistical systems that could pour fuel and shells over an exposed beach faster than German artillery could shred them. Britain had learned, at Norway and Crete and in 100 smaller embarrassments, that improvisation against a prepared enemy was not heroism but waste. A failed landing in France would not simply lose men, it would break the illusion of Allied competence and invite catastrophe across every front. Yet doing nothing was also a decision, and the war did not permit neutrality of action. The Mediterranean still burned with unfinished business. Malta starving under siege, the Suez lifeline threatened, and North Africa a chessboard where the Axis could threaten the Middle East's oil and sever imperial arteries that kept Britain supplied. In Cairo and Alexandria, commanders watched fuel gauges and spare parts as closely as enemy movements. In Tripoli and Benghazi, German and Italian supply ships ran their own gauntlet, and each sunk freighter shifted the desert balance. North Africa was not the main battlefield in theory, but in practice it was where the war could still be moved by force rather than hope. Churchill's instincts always reached for the places where the enemy's grip was weakest, where geography could serve as an ally and not a trap. He spoke of the Mediterranean as if it were a living corridor, one that could be opened to shorten shipping routes, move armies faster, and strike where German strength thinned at the edges. He also understood the politics of coalition warfare with brutal clarity. America needed an offensive it could see, a battle it could fight soon, and a victory it could explain to a public newly awakened to global war. Waiting to build the perfect invasion force for France risked giving allies and enemies alike the sense that the Axis dictated the tempo forever. But the obstacle was not only the enemy, it was the trained caution of professionals whose careers had taught them to distrust optimistic schedules and political deadlines. Senior commanders in Washington and London counted landing craft like coins and knew how few existed, how many would be lost, and how long it took to build more. They remembered the beaches of Gallipoli from an earlier war and the bitter lesson that sea and land meet in a killing zone when the defender has time. When Churchill began pressing for a major operation away from France, a thrust that could pry open the war's locked doors, he was pressing against the muscle memory of an entire military generation. The idea had hovered in staff papers under bland names that concealed sharp intent. An invasion of French North Africa, once sketched as a possibility if circumstances demanded it, now glimmered as the only move that could turn defense into offense quickly enough to matter. It promised ports, airfields, and a chance to trap Axis forces between two Allied armies, one advancing from Egypt, the other landing from the sea, if timing and luck aligned. It also threatened diplomatic chaos because the coastline belonged to Vichy France, a regime neither fully enemy nor truly friend, guarded by soldiers whose loyalties were divided and whose guns were real. The plan looked like compromise to politicians and like hazard to generals, and it was into that gap, between necessity and reluctance, that Churchill stepped. When Churchill crossed the Atlantic in the weeks after America entered the war, the journey itself carried the taste of the conflict's new scale. The ocean was no longer distance, it was contested space, a dark expanse where a periscope could turn a strategic conference into a funeral at sea. Even aboard a heavily protected ship, the reality of U-boat hunting shaped every hour. Zigzag patterns, blacked-out nights, and the knowledge that steel bulkheads were thin arguments against a torpedo's certainty. Churchill arrived in Washington carrying more than papers. He carried the pressure of a nation that had already spent 2 years as the world's last organized resistance. The meetings that followed, later remembered as the Arcadia Conference, were an attempt to make alliance into machinery. Germany first became the declared priority, an admission that defeating Hitler's Europe would decide the war's character, even while the Pacific demanded immediate attention. The combined chiefs of staff were born from this need, an arrangement so intimate it required nations to share plans, shipping schedules, and the grim truth of their own weaknesses. In conference rooms thick with cigar smoke and impatience, strategy became not theory but negotiation. Each request weighed against the other's domestic politics and the merciless calendars of production. American planners, especially the Army leadership, saw a direct logic: build up forces in Britain and strike across the Channel as soon as possible. They thought in terms of decisive points, main efforts, and the kind of clear objective that could be measured on a map: a lodgment in France, a breakout, a march toward the Ruhr. To them, peripheral operations risked becoming a habit, a way to collect victories that did not kill the German army's heart. The impatience was not recklessness alone, it was an understanding that the Soviet Union was bleeding on an unimaginable scale, and that every month without a second front might end in Soviet collapse or bitter post-war consequences. British leaders, scarred by 1940 and aware of the narrow margin that had saved them then, evaluated the same proposal with a different kind of fear. They could not forget the reality of German air power based close to the Channel, the density of coastal defenses, and the simple fact that amphibious assault was an art of logistics more than valor. They also faced the uncomfortable truth that Britain had already spent much of its professional army in earlier campaigns, and replacements could not be trained into competence overnight. A failed cross-channel attack would not just be a military loss, it could unravel Britain's position as a credible partner and tempt enemies to strike at the empire's vulnerable seams. Churchill moved within these arguments like a man reading not only the room but the future. He admired American energy, yet he distrusted American inexperience in the particular kind of war now required. A war where sea lift, air superiority, and supply throughput mattered more than the romance of the offensive. He did not need to be convinced that France was the ultimate destination. He needed to prevent a premature attempt that would end with bodies floating off a hostile shore and an alliance traumatized into paralysis. His task was delicate: to restrain without insulting, to redirect without appearing to evade. Behind the formal agendas lay the unspoken challenge of coalition leadership. Roosevelt needed to demonstrate to Congress and the public that America's entry into the war meant action, not a long apprenticeship while Britain chose safer fights. Churchill needed to keep American power engaged in Europe while protecting Britain from the consequences of American haste. Every proposal was therefore more than a plan, it was a message about seriousness, competence, and the kind of war the alliance intended to wage. Churchill understood that strategy could not be separated from psychology. Allies required confidence, and confidence required visible movement. In the margins of the conference, alternatives were examined with the coolness of men searching for a lever in a locked room. North Africa returned repeatedly, not as a grand dream but as a practical opening. It offered ports that could be seized with less risk than the French coast, airfields that could reach into the Mediterranean, and the possibility of clearing Axis influence from the southern sea lanes. It also offered a way to draw American troops into battle against German forces without staking everything on the single role of a cross-channel invasion. For Churchill, it was the kind of operation that could create momentum, an entry wound in the Axis system that could widen with time. But even as the idea formed, it met resistance from professionals trained to despise half measures. Many American generals feared that once committed to North Africa, the alliance would drift into Italy, the Balkans, and other sideshows, consuming landing craft and divisions until the main blow in France became perpetually postponed. Some British commanders shared a quieter worry, that a landing against Vichy French territory might ignite political firestorms, fracture the French Empire, and produce battles against men who should, in a better world, be comrades. The operation demanded not only military planning but a moral and diplomatic gamble. As Churchill prepared to leave Washington, the future remained unresolved, and the unresolved carried its own danger. The alliance had agreed on priorities, but priorities did not automatically become operations. Ships had to be built, units trained, and risks accepted. In London, the war room still echoed with the daily toll of bombs and shipping losses, and in Moscow the front lines still boiled with Soviet desperation. Churchill returned across the Atlantic knowing that the next decisive contest would not be with Hitler directly, but with the reluctance of his own coalition's generals, men who believed the only honest way to beat Germany was to charge straight at its wall, even if the wall was not yet breakable. By the spring of 1942, the war's pressure points tightened like wire around the Allied throat. In the Atlantic, convoy escorts fought a battle of inches, radar sets that could see a little farther, depth charges set a little better, escort groups trained to hunt rather than merely defend, yet merchant ships still vanished with terrifying regularity. In Asia, British prestige had been smashed at Singapore, a defeat that carried not only strategic loss but a psychological humiliation that echoed through colonies and capitals. The Axis seemed to operate with one cruel advantage: it dictated the timetable, forcing the Allies to respond everywhere at once. American military leadership felt the weight of obligation to the Soviet Union with increasing anger. Each communiqué from the East carried casualty figures that sounded like fiction, and each month that passed without a Western front looked, to Soviet eyes, like betrayal. In Washington, staff officers produced plans with names that sounded clean and technical. Sledgehammer for an emergency landing in France in 1942, Roundup for a larger invasion later, while behind those names lay the blunt reality of beaches, German divisions, and the necessity of air supremacy. The plans reflected American belief in decisive action, but they also reflected American confidence that the war could be organized like an industrial project if only the schedule were forced. British assessments were more cautious, and not from lack of courage. They had watched the Germans master operational tempo in 1940, seen France collapse in weeks, and learned that morale, once broken, did not return simply because leaders demanded it. Their intelligence services reported on German coastal fortifications and the density of forces that could be moved by rail to meet an invasion. Their air commanders knew that fighters needed forward airfields and maintenance capacity. Without them, an invasion could become an exposed, starving island of men on a hostile continent. To promise success without those conditions felt like lying to the soldiers who would pay. Churchill stood at the intersection of these calculations, neither soldier nor civilian in the shallow sense, but a war leader with a memory longer than most and an appetite for risk that did not rely on ignorance. He could be ruthless with generals, demanding offensives and dismissing pessimism, yet he also understood when pessimism was simply the voice of arithmetic. His problem was that arithmetic itself was grim. Landing craft production lagged, trained amphibious divisions were rare, and the Luftwaffe, though strained, still had the ability to concentrate power over the Channel in ways the Allies could not yet match. The perfect plan for France did not exist in 1942, but neither did the luxury of waiting. In London, the War Cabinet faced another kind of threat: alliance cohesion. If America believed Britain was hiding behind caution to preserve its empire and avoid bloodshed, resentment would grow into strategic fracture. If the Soviet Union believed the West deliberately delayed relief, Stalin's mistrust would harden, shaping post-war realities as surely as any battle. Churchill therefore needed an operation that did not merely win ground, but proved intent, an action that could be shown to allies as evidence that the Anglo-American partnership was not theoretical. War was fought with divisions, but alliances were fought with perception. Small operations provided lessons in blood, and those lessons mattered. Commando raids along the French coast proved that surprise could be gained, but also revealed how quickly defenders could respond when they controlled roads and airfields. The disastrous raid at Dieppe, planned under pressure for action, exposed what happened when armor, infantry, naval gunfire, and air support failed to synchronize on a fortified shore. Tanks trapped on shingle, men pinned against seawalls, and casualties that taught hard truths about firepower and planning. For Churchill, Dieppe was not merely a tragedy, it was a warning flare shot into the strategic debate, evidence that a premature cross-channel attempt could become a catastrophe on a far greater scale. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean continued to demand attention as if it were a separate war with its own appetite. Malta's survival required convoys that ran a gauntlet of bombers and submarines, battles that became contests of endurance and improvisation. The Eighth Army in Egypt fought with the knowledge that defeat could open the path to the Nile and beyond, threatening oil supplies and the stability of the Middle East. North Africa was where the Axis could be confronted without immediately crashing against the wall of the French coast, and it offered something else: a chance to learn the mechanics of combined operations on a scale that could prepare the alliance for France later. Churchill began shaping the argument not as a rejection of the French invasion, but as a necessary prelude to it. He framed North Africa as a way to bleed Axis forces, secure the Mediterranean, and build the confidence and competence of a coalition that had never fought together at full scale. The point was not to avoid the main battle but to arrive there with an army that had learned to land, supply, and command under fire. Generals who despised the idea saw it as delay. Churchill saw it as the only path to a future that was not built on a single desperate gamble. The operation's outlines grew clearer even as objections hardened. To land in French North Africa meant confronting Vichy forces whose loyalties were uncertain, whose commanders might resist to preserve honor, and whose political leaders might bargain for advantage. It meant shipping troops across oceans guarded by submarines, then unloading them on beaches where the weather could tear apart schedules and the surf could drown men before bullets did. It meant that a political leader, Churchill, would have to force the alliance to accept a war plan that felt, to many professionals, like choosing the long road when the house was on fire. Yet Churchill had learned that in war the shortest road on a map could be the longest road in corpses. The summer of 1942 brought crises that felt less like events than like blows. In North Africa, Axis advances threatened to shatter the British position. In the east, the Soviet front groaned under the weight of German offensives aimed at oil and river lines that could choke the heart of Russia. The sea lanes still demanded constant sacrifice, and Britain's economy, already strained, operated like a man running on a wound that would not close. Victory was still imaginable, but only if the Allies could seize the initiative somewhere, anywhere, before the Axis used its advantage to cement permanence into conquest. The fall of Tobruk in June was one of those blows that carried moral shock far beyond its strategic value. A fortress that had held out before had now collapsed quickly, taking with it prisoners and the sense that British arms were regaining confidence. News reached London like grit in the throat. Parliament demanded answers, newspapers sharpened their tone, and the enemy propaganda machine worked eagerly to paint Britain as exhausted. Churchill, who had spent political capital insisting Britain could endure, now faced the possibility that endurance alone would no longer be enough to keep Allies convinced. It was in this atmosphere that Churchill returned to Washington to confront the strategic argument at its fiercest. In meetings with Roosevelt and the American High Command, maps were unrolled, production tables consulted, and schedules argued over with the intensity of men who knew history would not forgive miscalculation. General Marshall and his staff pressed hard for a cross-channel operation, warning that anything else would postpone the decisive battle and allow Germany to fortify further. Their logic was cold and compelling. Every diversion meant another winter of war, another year of Soviet suffering, another year for German industry to turn occupied Europe into a fortress. Churchill countered with a different kind of coldness, the coldness of a man who had watched coalitions crack. He did not deny the need to return to France. He questioned whether returning in 1942 would be anything but a massacre followed by strategic paralysis. He described the shortages, landing craft, trained assault divisions, air cover capacity, not as excuses but as the real terrain on which plans either lived or died. He carried in his mind the image of Dieppe wreckage and imagined it multiplied across an entire coast, the alliance's first great joint battle ending not with liberation but with a beachhead turned into a graveyard. The argument Churchill made was not merely military, it was political in the deepest sense because it dealt with the relationship between action and confidence. America needed a place to fight Germany soon, not in abstract future promises, or else public support could sour into frustration and isolationist reflex. Britain needed American troops engaged in a theater where victory was possible with existing resources, to prove that the partnership could deliver results and to keep the alliance's moral center intact. Churchill proposed North Africa as the arena where the alliance could move from intention to execution without staking everything on a single throw. Roosevelt listened with the instincts of a politician who understood that wars are won by societies as much as by armies. He had promised action and faced elections, headlines, and the brutal need to show that America's entry into war meant more than speeches. He also faced the internal challenge of overrule. To choose North Africa was to tell his own generals that their preferred plan would wait, that strategy would bow to a blend of readiness and politics. Churchill's pressure mattered here not because it bullied Roosevelt, but because it gave Roosevelt a defensible path, one that could be framed as an offensive step toward Germany rather than an evasion of it. In July 1942, the decision crystallized with the kind of suddenness that often follows long argument. The United States would commit to landings in North Africa that year. The choice was a strategic pivot forced by circumstance and persuasion, and it landed like a thunderclap inside the American military establishment. Many officers saw it as a political imposition, a compromise that sacrificed the purity of decisive warfare for the messy realities of coalition management. Yet the decision was made, and once made it demanded speed, because delay would allow the Axis to reinforce Tunisia, tighten the Atlantic threat, and turn the Mediterranean into a trap. The reaction among generals ranged from skepticism to quiet fury, not because they lacked courage, but because they could already see the operational problems marching toward them. Split landing areas, uncertain French response, long supply lines, and the danger of Axis air power based near Tunisia and Sicily. They feared the operation would bog down and consume resources while the German army in France grew stronger behind concrete. Churchill understood those fears. He had, in his own way, made them part of the case. But he also understood something else, that a war without momentum is a war already half lost, and that sometimes the only way to break stagnation is to force a decision before the comfortable arguments for delay become permanent. Once the decision was made, time became an enemy again, more intimate and relentless than any German commander. Planning staffs worked as if chased because they were. Every week lost to debate would be paid back in blood on a shoreline. Eisenhower, chosen to command, inherited not a finished plan but a political imperative shaped into a military order, and the weight of that order was crushing because the operation demanded unity among forces that had never fought together at this scale. Headquarters structures had to be invented, communications integrated, and 1,000 procedural differences hammered into something that could function under fire. Even the operation's name carried a hint of the psychological battle it aimed to win. A torch implies darkness and the act of carrying light forward, but it also implies fragility. One gust can snuff it out. The Allied landing would need to establish ports quickly, build airfields from scratch, and push east before the Axis could pour men and machines into Tunisia. It was not enough to land. The landing had to be the opening movement of a pursuit, the kind of aggressive follow-through that would turn a beachhead into a campaign. The most contentious argument inside the plan was geography, because geography was inseparable from politics. The British favored landing as far east as possible, near Algiers and Oran, so the Allies could race to Tunis before German reinforcements arrived. Americans insisted on including Casablanca and Morocco, fearful that if Spain entered the war or the Mediterranean became impassable, the entire expedition might be cut off from Atlantic supply. The result was a compromise that looked, to many, like a recipe for dilution. Landing spread across vast distances, forces divided by hundreds of miles of road and poor infrastructure, and precious shipping allocated to multiple objectives at once. Landing craft, the unglamorous currency of amphibious war, were never sufficient. Each craft required engines, trained crews, and maintenance that could not be improvised on a beach under fire. Schedules were constrained by tide tables and moonlight, and by the need to synchronize naval gunfire, air support, and infantry movement with a precision that peacetime exercises rarely achieved. The Allies were building an invasion system while attempting to use it, a dangerous paradox that meant training would always be incomplete and mistakes would be inevitable. Torch was designed not only to take territory but to teach the alliance how to conduct war at the seam between sea and land. The command relationships reflected coalition necessity as much as operational logic. Naval forces, air forces, and ground forces each carried their own cultures and doctrines, and now had to operate under a unified strategy while still answering to national chains of command. British experience in the Mediterranean offered hard-earned knowledge. American industrial power promised future dominance. Both required respect to prevent rivalry from turning into sabotage by ego. Eisenhower's role, therefore, was as much diplomatic as military, holding together a structure that could collapse under stress even if the enemy fired no shots. Intelligence offered advantages but never certainty. Allied code-breaking and reconnaissance could provide glimpses of Axis shipping and intentions, yet the French factor remained a fog no intercept could fully penetrate. Would Vichy commanders fight to preserve honor? Would local officers switch sides out of hatred for Germany? Would colonial politics erupt into chaos that turned the landings into a diplomatic disaster? Torch had to be planned with branches of possibility rather than a single clean narrative, and in war, branching plans often meant confusion at the moment when clarity mattered most. Churchill watched these preparations with the impatience of a man who understood both the stakes and the fragility of coalition will. He pushed for speed, prodded for boldness, and demanded that the operation not become timid, because a timid landing would invite disaster as surely as a reckless one. Yet he also applied pressure behind the scenes to keep the political objectives aligned. The operation must strengthen the alliance, not fracture it. It must produce a forward motion toward Germany, not a static occupation that proved the critics right. His genius and his danger lay in refusing to treat military planning as a closed priesthood. He kept inserting the political truth that the war center could not hold if the alliance looked passive. As ships were gathered and units embarked, the operation began to feel less like a plan and more like an approaching storm. Men boarded transports with rifles cleaned obsessively and nerves disguised by jokes that fell flat in the salt air. Officers rehearsed beach diagrams as if repetition could force the future to obey, while sailors checked guns and radar sets knowing the coastline ahead might fire back from behind friendly flags. The breakthrough Churchill wanted, an Allied offensive that proved the war could be moved, was now balanced on the narrow edge between preparation and improvisation, and on the hope that force and politics could be synchronized at the moment of impact. The armada that moved toward North Africa did not feel like a single blade, it felt like a continent's worth of metal set adrift. Ships carried men from American ports and British harbors, converging through oceans where submarines still prowled with patient hunger. The movement itself was a test of coordination, radio silence, convoy discipline, and the quiet labor of navigators who understood that an error of miles could translate into disaster on a coast guarded by guns. At night, the sea swallowed the fleet's lights, and soldiers stood on deck staring into black water that seemed to hold the future inside it. The Western Task Force bound for Morocco carried the weight of the most controversial compromise. The Casablanca landing meant distance from Tunisia, distance from the immediate race east, and thus the risk that German forces would fortify the very prize Torch hoped to seize. Yet it also promised an Atlantic supply line less vulnerable to Mediterranean closure, and planners clung to that promise the way men cling to railings in rough weather. As the coastline of Morocco emerged from mist, the land looked deceptively calm. White buildings, low hills, and a morning sky that could have belonged to peace. The calm was a lie, but wars often begin with lies told by landscapes. The first assaults near Fadala and other landing points met the classic enemies of amphibious war before they met bullets: surf, confusion, and the tyranny of timing. Landing craft bucked under men who had rehearsed on quiet beaches and now found themselves drenched, seasick, and disoriented in darkness. Units landed off course, weapons were soaked, radios failed, and officers shouted orders that the wind tore apart. In those minutes, the grand strategic debate, France or Africa, decisive point or periphery, collapsed into the immediate struggle to get boots onto sand and keep the sand from becoming a grave. French resistance in Morocco was real and, in places, fierce because honor and order still mattered to the men behind the guns. Coastal batteries fired at ships that were supposed to be potential allies, and the psychological shock of that reality was sharp. American sailors found themselves returning fire against tricolor flags. Naval gunfire, meant to silence defenses quickly, created its own chaos as shells churned the shore and smoke hit targets. In Casablanca, the French naval presence complicated everything, because even incomplete or outmatched ships could still inflict damage in confined waters. Torch was being baptized not only in combat, but in the moral ambiguity of fighting those the Allies hoped to recruit. The naval battle off Casablanca became one of those violent episodes where minutes decide narratives. American warships engaged French vessels and shore positions with a mixture of caution and overwhelming force, seeking to end resistance without creating a massacre that would poison future cooperation. The unfinished battleship Jean Bart, moored yet armed, symbolized the strange half-state of Vichy power, neither fully alive nor dead, still capable of striking. Aircraft from carriers attacked, bombs fell, and the harbor became a theater of smoke and metal where strategic necessity eclipsed every sentimental instinct. The ocean itself seemed to recoil under the concussion of guns. On land, American troops pushed toward Casablanca through terrain that did not resemble the European battlefields many had imagined. Roads, villages, and open country offered fewer obvious defensive lines, yet every advance risked becoming a firefight with French units whose intentions could not be read until they opened fire or stood down. Casualties mounted in bursts. An ambush here, a machine gun position there, each one a reminder that limited resistance is still lethal. The operational goal was speed, but speed in such conditions meant accepting disorder, and disorder threatened to fracture inexperienced units at the moment they needed cohesion most. Airborne elements added another layer of friction to an already complex assault. Paratroopers and transport crews flew long distances over unfamiliar terrain, facing navigation challenges that scattered sticks of men and turned planned seizures of airfields into chaotic hunts across the countryside. Some landed miles from objectives, some lost equipment, some fought small, sharp actions to gather themselves under officers whose maps were suddenly worthless. Yet when airfields were finally secured, they became lifelines, allowing fighters and transports to begin stitching a logistical web over the beachhead. Torch was proving that modern war is won not only by seizing ground, but by creating infrastructure under fire. When Casablanca finally capitulated, the surrender carried relief, but not triumphal ease. The cost in lives and the bitterness of having fought French forces lingered, and commanders understood that political aftershocks would follow every military success. The harbor that had been the object now became a supply artery, its docks filled with the hard work of unloading crates, fuel drums, and vehicles at a pace that never felt fast enough. The breakthrough Churchill demanded was taking shape, but it was not yet a clean opening. It was a wound cut into the Axis system that could still become infected if the Allies failed to push through the pain and move east with relentless purpose. At Oran, the landings exposed how quickly a plan's elegant diagrams dissolve into violence. Assault troops came ashore under fire that felt personal, bullets snapping overhead, mortar bursts kicking sand into faces, and the cold realization that even a supposedly political battle still killed men the same way. A daring attempt to rush the harbor, intended to prevent the French from sabotaging docks and ships, turned into catastrophe when defending guns tore into the attackers at point-blank range. The sea around the harbor became littered with wreckage and the bodies of men who had been told speed could save them. Airborne operations near Oran revealed the thin line between innovation and disaster. Transport aircraft, stretched to their limits, navigated by imperfect instruments and improvised procedures, and the night scattered them like leaves. Paratroopers landed in unfamiliar fields, sometimes under fire, sometimes in silence so complete it felt unreal, and then had to find their objectives with compasses and instinct. When airfields were captured, it was often through small unit initiative rather than the clean execution of plan, sergeants and lieutenants making decisions in darkness that no staff officer could have predicted. Those airfields mattered not for symbolism but because fighters based there could begin contesting the skies against Axis aircraft poised to strike. The fighting at Oran ended not with a dramatic final assault, but with the grinding reality of pressure and inevitability. French commanders weighed honor against futility as their positions were outflanked and their supplies threatened. For Allied troops, especially Americans new to war, the experience was formative in the hardest way. Seeing friends hit, feeling the shock of artillery, and learning that courage is often simply continuing to move when the body wants to freeze. Oran became a lesson that amphibious operations could not be surgical in the way politicians like to imagine. They were blunt instruments that required resilience and luck. In Algiers, a different kind of battle unfolded. One fought in stairwells, offices and radio stations rather than on open beaches. Local resistance groups struck at key points, attempting to paralyze Vichy command long enough for Allied forces to land with minimal opposition. Their actions were risky and in a sense lonely. If the Allied ships failed to appear or were repelled, these men would be executed as traitors. The coup's success depended on timing measured in minutes, and its effect was immense. It created confusion in the Vichy chain of command, delaying coordinated resistance at the precise moment when resistance would have been most dangerous. The landings around Algiers benefited from that internal disruption, and the contrast with Oran and Casablanca was striking. Troops came ashore with fewer shots fired, yet the tension was arguably greater because uncertainty remained absolute. No one knew whether French forces would suddenly rally, whether German aircraft would arrive, whether the political bargain that underlay the operation would collapse. In the city, civilians watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as unfamiliar uniforms appeared, and as the old colonial order trembled under the weight of a new war. Algiers became the place where Torch's military and political dimensions collided most visibly. The invasion was succeeding precisely because French politics were fracturing under strain. Then came the unexpected pivot that defined the operation's moral ambiguity. Admiral François Darlat, a senior Vichy figure who happened to be in Algiers, became the center of a bargain that many would later call cynical and some would call necessary. Allied leaders sought a quick ceasefire to prevent bloodshed and to secure the ports and airfields needed for the rush to Tunisia, and Darlat had the authority to order French forces to stand down. Recognizing him, even temporarily, meant dealing with a man tied to a compromised regime, and the decision ignited outrage among those who wanted the war to remain morally clean. Yet in the arithmetic of the operation, every day saved meant a better chance to beat the Germans to Tunisia. Hitler's response was swift and brutal in its clarity. The remaining unoccupied portion of France was seized, erasing the illusion of Vichy autonomy and tightening German control of the French coastline. The French fleet at Toulon, faced with capture, was scuttled by its own sailors, ships blown and sunk by French hands to prevent them from serving Germany. It was an act of grim national pride and strategic consequence, a sign that even within compromised structures, some lines would not be crossed. Torch had triggered these chain reactions, proving that an operation in North Africa could reshape Europe's political map overnight. When news reached Churchill, it carried the strange taste of vindication mixed with sorrow. The landings had not been clean, the bargains not pure, and the bloodshed not avoided, yet the alliance had done something it had not done before. It had seized ground from the Axis orbit and forced the enemy to react on Allied terms. Churchill understood that generals had resisted Torch because it was uncertain and messy, but messiness was often the price of breaking strategic deadlock. The breakthrough was real now, an Allied foothold in Africa, ports opened, airfields captured, and a path eastward that could, if pursued ruthlessly, begin to tighten a noose around Axis forces trapped between desert and sea. With the coastal objectives secured, Torch entered the phase that determined whether it would become a strategic triumph or a prolonged entanglement: the race to Tunisia. Maps made the goal look simple: drive east, seize Tunis and Bizerta, and deny the Axis a base from which to contest the Mediterranean, but reality laid obstacles in every mile. Roads were poor, distances vast, and supply systems had to be invented as convoys unloaded into ports still recovering from battle and sabotage. The Allies possessed momentum, but momentum is fragile when it depends on fuel drums and spare parts that must travel overland through unfamiliar terrain. Eisenhower's headquarters became a hive of improvised coalition war. British and American officers argued over priorities, resources, and command relationships, aware that each decision would be judged by history and by the enemy. Air commanders demanded airfields and fuel, ground commanders demanded trucks and ammunition, naval commanders demanded protection for the shipping that fed everything. The logistical web had to expand faster than German aircraft could cut it, and every new airstrip scraped out of dirt became as valuable as any captured city. The breakthrough was no longer a moment of landing, it was the sustained act of building an offensive capability where none had existed. The Axis, though surprised by the scale of the landings, was not slow. German forces began pouring into Tunisia by air and sea, using proximity to Sicily to shuttle men and machines with a speed the Allies struggled to match. The strategic nightmare of Torch's planners began to take shape. The farther west the landings, the more time Germany had to fortify Tunisia and turn it into a bridgehead that could prolong the campaign. This was the risk Churchill had accepted, believing that a delayed decisive battle was preferable to a premature one in France, yet now delay threatened to create its own decisive struggle, one fought in winter mud rather than on open beaches. Early clashes around Mejaz el-Bab and other approaches revealed how quickly optimism could turn into hard fighting. Allied units advanced into terrain that channeled movement through valleys and passes, perfect for defense by an enemy skilled at combining armor, artillery, and air attack. Rain turned roads into traps, vehicles bogged down, supply columns became targets. Soldiers who had imagined Africa as open desert discovered that northern Tunisia could feel like Europe in winter, cold, wet, and unforgiving. In these conditions, the enemy's ability to reinforce quickly transformed Tunisia into a contested gate rather than an open road. Air power became the argument that settled many disputes because it imposed consequences without debate. German aircraft based in Tunisia and Sicily struck ports and road junctions, forcing the Allies to spread out supplies and build defenses faster than they could unload ships. Allied air forces, limited by available airfields and maintenance capacity, fought to gain dominance, and each sortie was a contest not only of skill but of logistics. How many aircraft could be kept operational, how much fuel could be delivered, how quickly repairs could be made. The campaign's tempo depended on these invisible factors, the kind that rarely appear in heroic narratives but decide wars. Intelligence offered glimpses of opportunity, yet opportunity remained difficult to seize. Allied code-breaking and reconnaissance could identify some Axis movements, but translating information into action required units positioned to exploit it, roads passable enough to move, and commanders willing to take risks. Coalition warfare added friction, because different national doctrines shaped how commanders interpreted risk and tempo. Where one officer saw a chance for a bold thrust, another saw the danger of overextension and supply collapse. The enemy benefited from this hesitation, using time to thicken defenses around Tunis and Bizerta. For the men on the ground, the campaign became a war of endurance rather than the dramatic sweep many had expected. Nights were spent in wet foxholes, boots never fully drying, with the sound of distant artillery like thunder that refused to leave the horizon. Civilians watched armies pass through their villages, sometimes offering quiet help, sometimes withdrawing behind shuttered doors, uncertain which flag would bring safety and which would bring reprisal. The human texture of Torch's aftermath was messy and intimate, a reminder that liberation and invasion can look similar to those caught under their shadow. The breakthrough was not only a strategic shift, it was a transformation of daily life across a region now dragged into the center of World War. Churchill pressed from afar with the same force that had driven the operation into existence, urging speed and aggressiveness because he understood the cost of letting Tunisia become a fortress. Yet he could not command mud to harden or trucks to multiply, and he could not prevent the enemy from exploiting proximity to Sicily. The operation he had forced into being was now becoming the kind of campaign generals had feared: complex, slow, and filled with compromises. Still, the essential truth remained: Allied forces were now fighting Germans on land in a theater of their choosing, learning the realities of coalition warfare under fire, and building the experience that would one day be required on the beaches of France. The Axis counterstroke that culminated at Kasserine Pass exposed the raw edges of the Allied coalition in the most unforgiving way possible. German commanders recognized that American formations were still learning, that their command relationships were often confused, and that their battlefield instincts had not yet been hardened by repetition under fire. They aimed to exploit these weaknesses with fast-moving armored thrusts, using combined arms in the manner that had shattered France in 1940. When the attack came, it came with the old German signature: speed, concentrated force, and a ruthless sense of where the enemy's seams were weakest. American units in Tunisia faced their first large-scale confrontation with German armor and experienced the shock of it physically. Tanks appeared not as isolated machines but as part of a system: artillery pounding positions, infantry probing flanks, aircraft striking road junctions and headquarters. Communications broke down, orders conflicted, and local commanders sometimes lacked clarity about whether to hold, withdraw, or counterattack. The battlefield became a place where courage was not enough, because courage without coordinated firepower and supply becomes only an invitation to be overrun. Kasserine was not a failure of individual men so much as a failure of a young war machine still assembling itself under the enemy's hammer. The pass itself turned into a funnel of fear: narrow terrain, dust and smoke, vehicles jammed, and the sense that the enemy understood the ground better. Soldiers who had arrived in North Africa imagining a romantic offensive found themselves retreating under pressure, learning how panic spreads through a column when rumors outrun orders. Wounded men waited for evacuation in conditions that felt primitive, while medics worked with desperate speed. The war's cinematic images, charging forward, flags flying, were absent. Instead there was the grim reality of survival and the quiet shame that follows a retreat, even when retreat is the only rational choice. The consequences of Kasserine were immediate and institutional. Allied commanders recognized that organization had to change, unity of command had to be real, not a paper arrangement, and battlefield leadership had to be sharpened. Eisenhower, under pressure, reshaped command structures, replacing leaders who had failed to impose discipline and clarity. The changes were not simply punitive. They were a recognition that war is an educational process conducted at lethal cost. In Tunisia, the coalition began turning defeat into a kind of weapon, using it to identify weaknesses before those weaknesses could destroy future operations. The arrival of tougher, more aggressive leadership in American formations brought a visible shift in tone. Training intensified even in the field, discipline tightened, coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was treated as survival rather than doctrine. Units learned to dig in properly, to establish overlapping fields of fire, to use reconnaissance aggressively rather than blindly advancing. These were not glamorous lessons, yet they were the foundation of later victories, because the Germans could be beaten only by meeting system with system. Torch's breakthrough was now paying its most important dividend. It was forcing the American army to become, quickly, the kind of force that could fight Germany on equal terms. At the same time, Montgomery's 8th Army, advancing from the east after El Alamein, pressed the Axis from another direction, tightening strategic pressure. The desert pursuit was its own kind of brutal march: long supply lines, exhausted vehicles, and the constant challenge of keeping an army fueled across hundreds of miles. The concept that had made Torch attractive, trapping Axis forces between two Allied armies, remained alive, but only if coordination could be achieved across national commands and difficult terrain. Tunisia was becoming a vice, but a vice works only if both jaws close with equal determination. Churchill watched these developments with a mixture of anxiety and vindication. Kasserine gave ammunition to Torch's critics, proof that the operation had plunged inexperienced American troops into a difficult theater and risked a protracted campaign. Yet it also proved something else: that America was now truly engaged against Germany, paying the price of learning that no amount of industrial power can avoid. Churchill understood that generals often resist operations because they fear the cost of mistakes, but mistakes are inevitable in war, and delaying engagement only delays the learning that must occur before decisive victory is possible. In Tunisia, the alliance was bleeding, but it was also hardening. As the coalition absorbed the shock, the front stabilized into a new, more competent posture. Defensive lines were better organized, artillery properly massed, air support more integrated. The enemy still held advantages in experience, but the Allies began to match those advantages with superior supply potential and growing tactical discipline. Torch, born as a controversial compromise, was transforming into a crucible that forged the alliance's future battlefield effectiveness. The breakthrough Churchill had forced was no longer measured only in captured ports, but in the creation of an Allied army capable of absorbing defeat without collapsing and of converting hard lessons into forward momentum. By spring 1943, Tunisia had become a contest of exhaustion where the balance began tilting toward the Allies with a steadiness that felt inevitable. Allied air power expanded as new airfields multiplied, and the sky, once a threat, became increasingly an instrument of control. Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean narrowed under attack, turning every shipment into a gamble that often ended in wreckage. The enemy still fought fiercely, but their margin shrank as fuel and ammunition became rationed by absence rather than discipline. War at last began to reflect Allied industrial advantage in the language it speaks best: relentless accumulation. Ground operations intensified with a new professionalism shaped by the winter's lessons. Artillery was used with greater precision and concentration. Infantry attacks were supported by better coordination. Armor was deployed in ways that respected terrain rather than fighting it. British, American, and other Allied units learned the rhythm of set-piece assaults, reconnaissance, bombardment, advance, consolidation, and learned that victory often means repeating that rhythm until the enemy's defenses crack. The fighting was still brutal, still intimate, but it was now conducted with a growing sense that the coalition was learning how to apply power methodically rather than impulsively. Tunisia was becoming the rehearsal stage for later invasions. In the south, battles along defensive lines showed how hard the Axis would fight when cornered. Positions built on ridges and in valleys forced attackers to pay for every yard, and mines turned advances into slow, meticulous labor under fire. Engineers became as important as riflemen, clearing paths through wire and explosive fields while artillery shells searched for them. In these moments, the war's human experience was not heroic spectacle but endurance. Men crawling forward with mine detectors, tanks inching behind them, and commanders watching clocks because daylight and darkness both carried their own dangers. As Allied pressure mounted, the Axis position in Tunisia began to feel like a tightening room. No space to maneuver, no safe rear, and fewer options with each passing week. German commanders, skilled and stubborn, attempted counterattacks to buy time and disrupt Allied preparations, but time itself had become hostile. Air attacks punished movement, naval interdiction starved supply, and Allied artillery, now better managed, punished concentrations of troops. The enemy could still inflict pain, but the ability to shape the campaign's direction slipped away. The Vichy Churchill had imagined was finally closing. The final offensives were marked by a kind of grim efficiency. Allied forces struck in coordinated waves, pushing through defensive belts, exploiting weak points, and refusing to allow the enemy to re-establish coherent lines. Towns and hills changed hands under bombardment that reduced landscapes into shattered geometry. Civilians endured the collapse of authority and the chaos of retreat, hiding in cellars while armies fought above them, uncertain whose victory would mean survival and whose would mean reprisal. Victory was coming, but it did not come cleanly. It came as ruin. When the Axis position finally broke, surrender did not feel like celebration so much as release from a prolonged strain. Columns of prisoners marched under guard, tens of thousands, then more, men exhausted, hungry, and often stunned that the war had turned against them so decisively. The scale of capitulation was strategic in its implications. An entire Axis army group removed from the board, a loss in men and material that Germany could ill afford. For Allied soldiers, it was a transformation of self-image. They had begun Torch uncertain, divided, and learning. They ended Tunisia with proof that they could defeat German forces on land. Churchill saw in Tunisia's end the validation of the operation he had forced through opposition. The breakthrough had not been instant and it had not been painless, but it had changed the war's direction. The Mediterranean's western gate was now in Allied hands, and the alliance had gained a battlefield competence that no staff exercise could provide. Critics could still argue that the same effort might have been better spent preparing for France, Yet Churchill could point to the reality that without Tunisia, the Allies would have faced 1944 with less experience, less confidence and fewer secure routes. In war, the path to the decisive blow is often paved by battles that look, beforehand, like distractions. Yet the victory carried uncomfortable truths that did not fit triumphant narratives. The political compromises made in North Africa left scars, questions of legitimacy, colonial power, and the uneasy alliances formed out of necessity. The campaign also revealed how quickly war exposes the limits of idealism, forcing leaders to choose between moral clarity and operational urgency. For the men who fought, Tunisia was remembered not as a strategic argument won but as a sequence of mud, heat, fear and comrades lost. The breakthrough Churchill had demanded had been purchased, as all breakthroughs are, with lives that would never see the maps they had helped redraw. With North Africa secured, the Mediterranean transformed from a liability into an opportunity, and opportunity in war is as dangerous as it is promising. Ports and airfields that had been contested now became staging grounds, and the sea lanes that once felt like a trap began to resemble an artery. Shipping could move more freely, shortening routes that had previously required detours around Africa, and the Allied ability to concentrate forces increased with every convoy that arrived unmolested. The war's geography had shifted, and geography is often the silent partner in every decision that follows. Strategic conferences now carried a different tone because success changes the shape of argument. Allied leaders could point to a tangible victory and claim that the coalition's approach, cautious when necessary, bold when possible, worked. At Casablanca in early 1943, broad principles were declared and future offensives discussed with a confidence that would have sounded like fantasy a year earlier. Yet behind the declarations lay old tensions. American leaders still wanted the cross-channel invasion as the main act, while Churchill pressed to exploit Mediterranean openings that seemed, to him, like the most efficient way to keep pressure on Germany. Torch had created momentum, and now the struggle was over where that momentum would be spent. The next target, Sicily, carried both logic and hazard. It offered control of sea lanes, a platform to attack Italy, and the possibility of knocking one Axis power out of the war. It also threatened to become another campaign of attrition if the enemy reinforced and fought stubbornly, consuming landing craft and divisions needed for France. The debates were sharpened by logistics, because landing craft remained the bottleneck of amphibious warfare, and every craft sent into the Mediterranean was a craft not available for a future channel crossing. Strategy, again, was constrained by the unromantic math of shipyards and training schedules. Yet Sicily promised something that mattered beyond tactics. It promised political shock. Italy's regime was brittle beneath its rhetoric, strained by defeats, shortages, and the quiet awareness that Germany treated Italy as a junior partner at best. A successful invasion could trigger internal collapse, forcing Italy's leaders to choose between continued alliance with Germany and the survival of their state. Churchill understood the value of such shock, because he had always sought not merely to defeat enemy forces but to fracture enemy cohesion. War is often decided when alliances break and governments fall, not only when armies are destroyed. For soldiers and sailors, the prospect of another amphibious assault carried a different weight after Torch. They were no longer innocent of the sea's cruelty or the coast's lethal unpredictability. Training became more focused, less theatrical, because men now knew what mattered. Unloading quickly under fire, keeping units together, securing high ground and roads before defenders could organize. Commanders who had learned in Tunisia understood the value of airfields and supply depots as much as the value of capturing towns. Torch's greatest contribution was now visible in the competence with which the next invasion could be planned. Churchill pressed hard to maintain tempo, aware that the Axis would use any pause to fortify and recover. He feared the strategic paralysis that can follow victory when leaders become cautious, content to consolidate rather than exploit. He also feared the political consequences of inaction. The Soviet Union still demanded relief, and every delay risked convincing Stalin that Western promises were hollow. The Mediterranean, in Churchill's mind, offered a way to keep fighting Germany while building toward the eventual cross-channel blow. It was an argument rooted not in romance but in the belief that pressure must be constant, like water wearing down stone. The human experience of preparation carried its own atmosphere, ports crowded with ships, airfields buzzing with new squadrons, soldiers writing letters with the strange calm that comes when men accept that fear is inevitable. In North Africa, units reorganized, replaced losses, and absorbed replacements who listened to veterans with wide eyes. Civilians in liberated cities watched the build-up with mixed emotions, knowing that armies bring both protection and disruption. The war's machinery was now turning with greater speed, and the men inside it could feel that they were being carried toward another coastline. Torch, once derided as a compromise, had become a platform from which the alliance could choose its next moves. That fact did not end the strategic argument, it intensified it, because success gives factions evidence to claim they were right. Churchill used Torch as proof that peripheral operations could generate decisive effects, while his critics used it as proof that peripheral operations consumed time and resources that could have been invested in France. The truth lived somewhere in the tension. Torch had forced the alliance into motion and taught it how to fight, but it had also deepened the coalition's struggle over where the war's center truly lay. The next invasions would test whether Churchill's forced breakthrough was a stepping stone, or a detour that happened to succeed. When the assault on Sicily came, it carried the imprint of everything learned in North Africa. The necessity of air superiority, the importance of rapid buildup ashore, the reality that weather and navigation could humble even the best staffs. Landings unfolded amid confusion and courage, with units scattered by wind and waves yet driven forward by the urgent need to seize ground before the defender could organize. The island's terrain, mountains, narrow roads and fortified towns, turned advance into hard, incremental combat rather than a sweeping dash. Yet the operation achieved its strategic purpose by proving, again, that the Allies could project power and hold what they seized. The psychological shock rippled far beyond the beaches. In Italy, the regime that had wrapped itself in rhetoric and parade ground certainty began to crack under the weight of cumulative failure. Political elites, sensing that Germany's war was a sinking ship, moved to protect themselves and their country, and the collapse of Mussolini's leadership revealed how quickly an authoritarian structure can unravel when it loses the aura of inevitability. For Churchill, this was the kind of fracture he sought, not merely defeating units, but shaking the political foundations that kept the Axis coherent. Torch had opened the Mediterranean door, Sicily kicked it wider. Italy's subsequent negotiations and eventual armistice exposed the cruel complexity of coalition war. German forces moved swiftly to occupy key areas and disarm Italian units, turning former allies into captives and in many places, enemies overnight. The Allied advance into the Italian mainland became a new campaign shaped by mountains, rivers and defensive lines chosen by a skilled enemy fighting on interior roads. The promise of Italy as the soft underbelly met the reality that an underbelly can still have ribs, hard terrain and disciplined defenders. The breakthrough Churchill had forced continued to yield strategic effects, but not without extracting further cost. At Salerno and later operations, the Allies faced the enduring truth that amphibious assaults are always risky, even when experience grows. Landings could be met by counterattacks that threatened to push invaders back into the sea, and commanders had to balance aggression with the need to build supply and artillery strength ashore. Air power and naval gunfire became lifelines, and each decision felt like a wager placed under the gaze of history. The campaign demanded persistence more than brilliance, and persistence is often the hardest quality to sustain when casualties mount and progress appears slow. Torch had begun the education, Italy continued it with relentless exams. Anzio, conceived as another attempt to break deadlock through bold landing, became a reminder that audacity without exploitation can freeze into stalemate. A beachhead seized could become a trap if momentum was not converted into rapid advance, and the enemy's ability to respond quickly could transform tactical opportunity into months of trench-like suffering. The human cost was etched into the landscape: flooded fields, artillery scars, and the quiet dread of soldiers who learned to recognize incoming shells by sound. These were the kinds of outcomes Torch's critics had feared, operations that promised breakthroughs and delivered grinding attrition instead. Yet even these campaigns tied down German divisions, bleeding the enemy away from other fronts. In Washington, frustration persisted among those who believed the Mediterranean consumed resources needed for the eventual return to France. They watched landing craft allocations, division assignments, and shipping schedules like accountants of strategic opportunity, fearful that the Channel invasion would be perpetually postponed. The argument was not merely theoretical, it shaped decisions about production, training, and command appointments. Churchill, aware of the resentment his preferences could generate, relied again on the political and psychological logic that had driven Torch. Keep fighting, keep pressure, keep the alliance in motion. He believed that a coalition that stops moving begins to doubt itself. Yet the Mediterranean campaigns also created leaders and systems that would later be indispensable. Commanders learned how to coordinate multinational forces, manage vast supply chains and integrate air, sea and land power into a single operational rhythm. The American army that would later land in Normandy carried scars and lessons from North Africa and Italy, and the Allied command structure, so fragile at first, grew stronger under strain. Torch's forced breakthrough had initiated this growth, turning an alliance into a fighting organism rather than a diplomatic agreement. War does not forgive inexperience, and Torch had ensured that inexperience would be burned away before the final return to France. Churchill's role in these developments remained controversial even among his admirers, because his strategic vision carried both insight and stubbornness. He had forced the alliance to choose action over argument, yet action had led into complex terrain where victory was slow and costly. He had also prevented what he believed would have been disaster in 1942 on the French coast, buying time for the buildup that would eventually make Normandy possible. The narrative of Torch, therefore, could not be simplified into vindication or mistake. It was a turning of the wheel, a decision that shaped the war's tempo and taught the alliance how to fight at the price of ambiguity. In that ambiguity lay the true nature of Churchill's breakthrough. It was not simply a landing, but the act of dragging reluctant institutions into a new phase of war before they felt ready. The fiercest debates about Torch did not end with victory. They sharpened afterward, because success invites counterfactuals. Critics argued that North Africa and Italy delayed the cross-channel invasion, granting Germany time to fortify the Atlantic Wall and deepen its defensive belts. They pointed to the months spent fighting in Tunisia's mud and Italy's mountains as months that could have been spent accumulating forces and refining plans for France. In their view, Torch was a politically motivated detour that happened to work, but at a strategic price that was paid later in blood on other fronts. This criticism carried weight because it came from professionals trained to think in decisive centers of gravity, and because the channel remained, in the end, the route to Germany's heart. Supporters countered with a different arithmetic, one rooted in readiness and risk. A 1942 cross-channel assault would have required capabilities the Allies did not yet possess, and failure would have been strategically catastrophic, perhaps delaying victory far more than Torch ever did. They argued that North Africa provided a theater where the alliance could fight Germany and learn without staking everything on one role, and that these lessons, command integration, amphibious logistics, combined arms coordination, were prerequisites for success in France. They pointed to Kasserine as proof that American forces needed a hard education before facing the full weight of German defenses in Normandy. In this view, Torch did not delay the decisive blow, it made the decisive blow possible. The Soviet dimension complicated every argument, because it carried moral and political consequence. Stalin demanded a second front in Europe, and every delay fed suspicion that the West preferred the Soviets to bleed while Britain and America conserved strength. Torch could be presented as relief, but it was relief at a distance from the Eastern Front, and the Soviet perspective measured solidarity in the geography of France, not Algeria. Churchill understood this, yet he also understood that a failed invasion of France would not help the Soviets. It would help Hitler, freeing German divisions to turn east again. Coalition warfare often forces leaders to choose between what an ally demands and what reality permits. Torch's political compromises in North Africa remained a stain for many who wanted the war's narrative to be purely moral. Bargaining with Vichy figures, sidelining free French legitimacy, and navigating colonial power structures revealed that victory often depends on deals that look unclean in retrospect. The Allies needed ports, airfields, and a quick ceasefire. They chose expediency, and expediency provoked outrage among those who believed wars must not only be won but must be won without compromising principles. Yet principles without victory would have meant a Europe permanently dominated by Nazi power, and Churchill, never sentimental about such dilemmas, often treated moral purity as a luxury that total war does not permit. That does not absolve the compromises, but it explains their logic. The colonial reality of North Africa added another layer of complexity that military planners rarely confronted honestly. Allied presence intersected with local populations who had endured French colonial rule and now watched yet another set of foreign armies claim to bring salvation. Political movements simmered beneath the campaign, and the war's upheaval changed the trajectory of North African history in ways that were not controlled by Allied intentions. Soldiers fighting for grand strategic goals often had little understanding of the local social tension their operations intensified. Torch's breakthrough, therefore, was not only military, it was a shockwave through colonial structures that would not return to their old form after the guns fell silent. Churchill's personal style, his refusal to accept purely military caution when political necessity demanded action, became both his strength and the source of lasting resentment among professionals. Generals often fear political leaders who meddle because meddling can kill men, yet generals also sometimes mistake their own institutional caution for strategic wisdom. Churchill did not always get it right, but he forced debate into decision, and decision into action, at moments when delay could become fatal. His ability to persuade Roosevelt over the objections of senior American commanders revealed something uncomfortable. In democratic war, generals do not own strategy, because strategy belongs to nations, and nations are represented by elected leaders. Torch was a demonstration of civilian authority applied with rare force. The soldiers and sailors who lived Torch did not experience it as a debate. They experienced it as a world of cramped ships, sudden gunfire, and foreign streets. They carried the memory of fighting French troops, a paradox that felt bitter even when it was explained as necessary. They carried the memory of learning under fire, of mistakes corrected too late for some friends. Those experiences created a shared Allied identity forged not by speeches but by hardship, an identity essential for later campaigns. Torch's ultimate effect may have been less about territory seized and more about the creation of a coalition army that could endure friction without breaking. In the end, the argument about whether generals wanted Torch misses a darker truth. War often presents only unwanted options. Churchill forced a breakthrough because the alternative was stagnation, and stagnation in 1942 carried the risk of Allied collapse through 1,000 small defeats. Generals resisted because they could see the hazards clearly, and because their duty is to avoid unnecessary risk. Churchill insisted because he could see the broader political and psychological hazard of inaction. Torch succeeded not because it was clean or easy, but because it created motion at a moment when motion itself was strategic survival. It was a breakthrough born from reluctance, driven by necessity, and remembered because it revealed how leadership sometimes means dragging institutions into battles they fear in order to prevent disasters they cannot yet imagine. When the Allies finally returned to France in 1944, the beaches and hedgerows carried echoes of earlier lessons learned far from Europe. The logistics of sustaining a lodgment, the discipline of integrating air power with ground movement, the necessity of unified command, these were not abstract principles discovered in staff papers. They were habits forged in North Africa's confusion and Tunisia's winter battles. The officers who directed vast formations in Normandy had often learned their craft in Torch's imperfect laboratory. In that sense, the forced breakthrough did not merely open a theater. It created the human and institutional competence that made later liberation possible. Eisenhower's rise from commander of a risky coalition invasion to supreme commander in Europe was itself a Torch legacy. His skill lay not in tactical brilliance alone, but in the ability to hold together competing national egos, to absorb political pressure without cracking, and to make decisions under uncertainty without losing legitimacy. Those qualities were tested first in North Africa, where success depended on negotiating French politics as much as defeating German forces. Torch taught that coalition war is as much about managing relationships as it is about moving divisions. Churchill had forced that lesson on the alliance early, before the stakes on the French coast became irreversible. The material lessons were just as profound. Amphibious operations demanded systems, landing craft allocation, beach organization, port rehabilitation, and the relentless scheduling of supplies, that had to be practiced under real conditions to become reliable. Torch exposed every weakness in these systems and forced improvements, because failure meant immediate operational consequence. By the time the Allies faced the stronger defenses of Normandy, their logistics and procedures were still imperfect, but they were no longer naive. The breakthrough Churchill had demanded was therefore also a breakthrough in operational maturity, a shift from improvised bravery to engineered warfare. Yet Torch's legacy also includes the uncomfortable reality that strategic success often carries moral compromise. The bargains made, the political exclusions, and the collisions with colonial structures remind us that wartime decisions are rarely judged by purity at the moment they are made. Leaders choose under pressure, with incomplete information, and with lives on the line that cannot be paused while philosophers debate. Churchill's insistence on Torch was grounded in the belief that victory was the prerequisite for any moral reconstruction of Europe. That belief does not erase the compromises, but it explains why he accepted them as the price of breaking the war's deadlock. Churchill himself remains the central tension of the story, a leader capable of magnificent clarity and maddening stubbornness, a man who could inspire a nation yet also drive professionals to fury. He did not force Torch because he enjoyed defying generals. He forced it because he believed time was the true enemy, and that delay could kill more surely than risk. He saw that America needed a battlefield against Germany, that Britain needed proof of Allied action, and that the Axis needed to be hit where it could be hit now. In forcing the breakthrough, he exposed a truth about leadership in total war. Sometimes the duty of command is to choose the least catastrophic option, even when no option feels good. For the men who landed on North African beaches, The breakthrough became a personal border between the world before and the world after. Before Torch, many had known only training grounds, maps and rumors. Afterward, they knew the sound of naval gunfire rolling over water, the shock of bullets cutting through surf, and the sickening quiet after a fight when names are called and no one answers. They also knew, later, the strange pride of seeing an enemy surrender and realizing that their suffering had bent history a fraction toward victory. Torch turned civilians into veterans and veterans into the backbone of future campaigns. It built an allied war culture, forged from shared fear and shared purpose. The operation also reshaped how nations understood one another. Americans learned that British caution could be strategic wisdom rather than timidity. Britons learned that American impatience could be powerfully productive when given a channel. The alliance's trust deepened not through perfect harmony but through surviving friction without breaking. Torch, in its messy way, proved that the coalition could fight together and endure setbacks together. Churchill's role in forcing that test was decisive, because without it, the alliance might have remained a promise waiting for readiness that never arrived soon enough. In the end, the breakthrough no general wanted became the kind of breakthrough history remembers precisely because it was unwanted, because it required leaders to defy comfort and accept uncertainty. It opened a route into the Axis system, removed an entire enemy force from the board, and set in motion campaigns that would pull Germany into a widening ring of pressure. It also demonstrated that strategic momentum is sometimes created not by perfect plans, but by the will to act when action is still possible. In the smoke-filled rooms beneath London, Churchill had understood a grim equation. If the alliance waited for the flawless opportunity, it might wait until there were none.